In the remote Cascades, a grieving illustrator named Sophie Mercer was about to spend 5 quiet days honoring her late mother. A solitary camping trip meant for healing turned deadly when ancient forest entities, known only through whispers, and symbols began closing in after dark. Sophie Mercer wasn't your typical solo camper. For 6 years, she'd served as a combat linguist in Army Special Operations, decoding enemy transmissions under extreme duress, once extracting intel that prevented a base ambush in northern Syria. When the Watchers marked her camp with spiral, stone patterns and began circling the Firelight, they had no idea they were facing someone trained to think tactically under siege. Sophie responded with ritual knowledge buried in her mother's journal, an invocation that would stir forces both protective and perilous. What began as a solo retreat became a battle at the boundary between worlds. The Cascades would never be the same after Sophie accepted her role as the new Firelight Sentinel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The old forestry road wound deeper into the Cascades like a fading scar, Sophie's SUV bouncing over ruts that threatened to swallow her tires whole. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, welcoming the jarring sensation. It felt like penance. "Almost there," she murmured, glancing at the small wooden box on the passenger seat. The urn was simple cedar, just as her mother would have wanted. No frills, no ornate carvings, just the wood and what remained inside. Sophie swallowed hard and returned her eyes to the disappearing road. After 3 hours of driving and another 2 of increasingly primitive pathways, the trail had appeared. Nothing more than a small clearing with a weather-beaten sign. Lost Ridge Trail. No facilities. Sophie killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of the cooling motor and the whisper of wind through towering firs. This was what she'd come for. Silence. Space. The indifference of wilderness. Sophie shouldered her pack with practiced movements, adjusting the straps until the weight settled comfortably. 42 pounds. She'd weighed it meticulously as she did all things. Water, food for 5 days, tent, sleeping bag, sketch pad, pencils, and her mother. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Sophie's breath came harder as she ascended, but she welcomed the burn in her legs and lungs. Physical pain was preferable to the hollow ache that had lived behind her ribs for months. "You always loved it up here?" she said aloud, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was speaking to. Callie had first brought her to this ridge when Sophie was 12, their first camping trip after her father left. The most honest place on earth, Callie had called it. 3 miles in, the forest thinned, and Sophie found the clearing just as memory had preserved it. A grassy plateau overlooking the sprawling valley below, snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. The September air carried the first hint of autumn, the promise of change. She made camp with mechanical efficiency, driving stakes into the earth, assembling poles, creating shelter. By the time her small dome tent stood sentinel at the clearing's edge, sweat had soaked through her shirt despite the cool air. She unpacked, her supplies organizing them in the vestibule of her tent, each item in its assigned place. Control, order. The things that had abandoned her when Mark had packed his things 6 months ago, muttering something about growing apart and different paths. 3 weeks later, her mother's cancer had returned with a vengeance, as if it had been lurking all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sophie knelt by her backpack and carefully removed her mother's box, placing it on a flat stone near the fire pit. "Well, we're here," she said, running a finger along the grain of the wood, "just like we planned." But they hadn't planned this. Her alone, Callie reduced to ash and bone, the last of their shared expeditions. Sophie built a small fire as dusk approached, the practiced ritual calming her. She boiled water for her dehydrated meal, eating without tasting, then pulled out her sketch pad as the light faded to a deep blue. Her pencil moved across the paper, capturing the silhouette of distant mountains, the texturing of clouds. The rhythmic scratching was hypnotic, familiar. This was who she was before everything crumbled. a woman who translated the wilderness to paper, who found meaning in the curve of a jay's wing or the architecture of a pine cone. When darkness fully claimed the ridge, Sophie set aside her sketch and pulled out her mother's journal, a leather-bound book she'd discovered while cleaning out Callie's apartment. The spine cracked softly as she opened it, the pages well-worn and filled with Callie's neat, precise handwriting. She'd read bits and pieces before, mostly Callie's botanical notes and sketches. But tonight, flipping through by firelight, she found entries she'd overlooked. May 16, 2018, Lost Ridge again. The stone circle remains undisturbed since my last visit. Elder Mitchell's stories echo here, guardians of fire and forest, watchers, at the threshold. I left the offering at the northwestern point as instructed. The air feels different after, charged, sentient. Sophie frowned, running her finger over the words. Her mother had never mentioned stone circles or guardians. Callie had been a botanist, a scientist, albeit one with a deep reverence for indigenous knowledge. But this sounded like something else entirely. She flipped forward several pages. September 3rd, 2019. Something followed me today. Not animal, not human. The boundary has thinned. I'm not afraid, strangely. The pendant grows warmer when I cross certain lines in the forest. Protection, perhaps? Or recognition? A sound from the darkness jolted Sophie from the journal. A distant howl that wavered in the night air. Not quite wolf, not quite coyote. Something in between, or perhaps something else entirely. She closed the journal and added another log to the fire, watching sparks spiral upward to join the stars. Just wildlife, she assured herself, but found her hand reaching for the hunting knife strapped to her belt. The Cascades had their predators: cougar, bear, the occasional wolf. She'd come prepared, understanding the risks of solitude. As the fire popped and hissed, Sophie sensed rather than saw movement at the periphery of the light's reach, a shadow shifting against shadows gone before her eyes could focus. The fine hairs on her arms rose despite the fire's warmth. "Hello?" she called, immediately feeling foolish. No one was out here. That was the point. Still, she rose and circled. Her campsite, the dancing firelight making the surrounding forest undulate with phantom movement. 20 paces from her tent, her boot struck something hard. Crouching, Sophie brushed away pine needles to reveal a smooth riverstone, then another, beside it. As she cleared more debris, a pattern emerged, a half-buried ring of stones, perhaps 5 feet in diameter, partially overtaken by the forest floor. Sophie's fingers traced the edge of one stone, finding it unnaturally warm despite the cool night air. She thought of her mother's journal. The stone circle remains undisturbed, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She backed away, returning to her fire, trying to dismiss the unease crawling up her spine. The journal was just Callie's poetic musings, her way of processing the wilderness. Nothing more. Yet as Sophie slid into her sleeping bag later, the fire burned down to glowing embers. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just beyond the dying light where the forest pressed close, she thought she glimpsed a pair of eyes, yellow, luminous, gone in an instant. Sleep came fitfully, fragmented by dreams of her mother walking ahead on a forest path, always just beyond reach, whispering words that dissolved into the rustling of leaves. Dawn arrived with merciful clarity, banishing shadows and uncertainty alike. Sophie stretched, muscles protesting from the unforgiving ground. She unzipped her tent and crawled out into the crisp morning air, and froze. 10 feet from her campsite, a massive pine bore 3 parallel gashes in its bark, the exposed wood pale and fresh against the dark outer layer, not the random scratchings of a bear or the territorial markings of a cat. These were deliberate, methodical. Beneath the tree, barely visible in the soft earth, was the distinct impression of a paw print. Large, four-toed, leading away into the underbrush. Sophie knelt to examine it, heart quickening. It looked canine, but larger than any wolf track she'd ever seen. And as she stared at the impressions leading away from her camp, she couldn't escaped the unsettling thought that whatever had left them had been circling her tent for hours. Silently watching as she slept, Sophie studied the paw prints, her fingertips hovering just above the indentations in the soft earth. They led away from her camp, disappearing into a dense patch of undergrowth. Logic told her to ignore them. Wild animals roamed these forests, after all, but the precision of those claw marks on the tree troubled her. 3 perfect parallel lines evenly spaced. Curiosity killed the cat, she muttered to herself, but reached for her pack anyway. Something in her mother's journal had stirred an unease she couldn't shake. She tucked the small hunting knife into her belt, took a long drink from her water bottle, and followed the tracks. The trail wound through thickening forest, sunlight filtering through in dappled patterns. The paw prints remained clear, as if whatever left them wanted to be followed. Sophie moved quietly, years of wildlife observation having taught her the value of silence. The tracks ended abruptly at a small clearing choked with blackberry brambles. Sophie frowned, scanning the area, when a faint whine caught her attention. She turned slowly toward the sound. Yellow eyes stared back at her from the undergrowth, one amber, one nearly white. They belonged to a large dog or something very close to a dog. Its coat was matted and dark, its frame gaunt but powerful. As it shifted slightly, Sophie saw the wound on its flank, a deep gash partially scabbed over. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching to appear less threatening. "You're hurt." The animal regarded her with unnerving intelligence, neither retreating nor approaching. Sophie slowly reached into her pack and pulled out a package of beef jerky. She tore off a piece and placed it on the ground between them. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog, if that's what it was, watched her steadily. It looked like a German shepherd, but larger, with something wilder in its bone structure. After a long moment, it limped forward, sniffed the jerky, and took it delicately. "Good," Sophie encouraged, tearing off another piece. This time she held it out in her palm. Minutes stretched into a quiet dance of trust. Each piece of jerky brought the animal closer until it stood just beyond arm's reach, still wary but no longer afraid. Its wound looked worse up close, deep and inflamed. "That needs cleaning," Sophie said, keeping her voice gentle. "Let's head back to camp." To her surprise, the dog followed her, maintaining a careful distance. Back at camp, Sophie filled a bowl with water and added a cap of the antiseptic she kept in her first aid kit. The real challenge would be getting close enough to treat the wound. She sat cross-legged on the ground, patient, waiting. The dog circled the perimeter of the clearing, sniffing occasionally at the ground. It stopped abruptly at the half-buried stone ring Sophie had discovered the night before. The animal's hackles rose, a low growl emanating from deep in its chest. "What is it?" Sophie asked, following its gaze. The stones looked harmless in daylight, just weathered river rocks arranged in a circle long ago. Yet the dog refused to cross them, instead backing away and circling to approach Sophie from the opposite direction. Strange, she thought, but focused on the task at hand. She offered more jerky, and this time the dog came close enough for her to see the full extent of its injury. The gash was long but clean, as if made by a single sharp implement rather than the chaotic tearing of a fight with another animal. "This might sting," she warned, slowly extending her hand with a cloth soaked in the antiseptic solution. The dog flinched at her touch but didn't pull away, watching her with those mismatched eyes. Up close, Sophie noticed a faded scar across its muzzle and another along its neck. Old wounds, long healed. This animal had survived much. "You're a tough one," she murmured as she cleaned the wound. The dog trembled slightly but remained still. "You need a name if you're going to stick around." She glanced at the cedar box containing her mother's ashes. "How about Ash?" The dog's ears perked at the sound, almost as if it understood. By afternoon, Sophie had cleaned and bandaged the wound, and Ash, the name had stuck immediately, lay near her fire pit watching as she sketched. There was something both comforting and unsettling about having the animal there. It was clearly wild, Yet it had allowed her to help it with an almost human comprehension of her intentions. "Where did you come from?" she asked, studying its unusual features. No collar, no sign it had ever been domesticated, yet it understood basic commands and had accepted food from her hand. As dusk fell, Sophie built up the fire and prepared her dinner. She shared her freeze-dried beef stew with Ash, who ate rapidly but neatly. After eating, the dog settled across the fire from her, its gaze frequently darting to the darkening woods beyond the campsite. Sophie pulled out her mother's journal again, flipping through until she found another entry about the ridge. November 12, 2019. The locals say animals won't cross certain boundaries in these woods. Elder Mitchell spoke of spirit lines invisible to human eyes but clear as fences to the creatures who know better. I'm beginning to see the patterns now. The stone circles mark safe ground, not for us, but from us. She looked up at Ash, remembering how it had refused to cross the stone ring. A chill ran through her despite the fire's warmth. The night deepened around them, the fire casting Sophie's only light. Ash had dozed off but woke suddenly, head snapping up, ears forward. A low growl rumbled from its throat as it stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. "What is it?" Sophie asked, straining to see. "A bear? Cougar?" Ash rose to its feet, hackles raised, the growl intensifying. Sophie grabbed her flashlight and shone it in the direction of the dog's gaze, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth. Then she heard it, a deep, rhythmic sound. Not quite breathing, not quite a voice. A resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating up through her bones. Ash's growl continued, a counterpoint to the strange pulsing tone. "Hello?" Sophie called out, her voice sounding thin and fragile against the vastness of the night. "Is someone there?" The sound stopped abruptly. Ash's growl faded to a whine, and the dog pressed against Sophie's legs, trembling slightly. "It's okay," she said as much to herself as to the dog. "Probably just the wind." But there was no wind that night, not even the slightest breeze. Sleep came fitfully. Sophie had expected Ash to disappear into the forest, but the dog remained vigilant at the foot of her tent, occasionally growling at noises she couldn't hear. When she did drift off, her dreams were fractured images, her mother walking beneath towering trees, whispering words in a language Sophie didn't recognize, Mark's face distorted in shadows, a circle of stones glowing in moonlight. She woke at dawn to find Ash sitting alert beside her, staring at something near the tent entrance. Sophie rubbed her eyes and followed the dog's gaze. Just outside her tent, 3 small stones had been stacked one atop the other in perfect balance. Beyond them, another stack, and another, 7 in total, arranged in a semicircle facing her tent. "What the hell?" she whispered, crawling outside. The stones were smooth river rocks similar to those in the half-buried ring. Each stack was perfectly balanced, impossible to have occurred naturally. Ash whined softly, pressing against her, sighed as she examined the nearest stack. The rocks were cool to the touch, but something about their arrangement sent a wave of unease through her. She hadn't heard anything in the night. No footsteps, no disturbance. Yet someone, or something, had been here, close enough to touch her tent while she slept. Sophie glanced at the cedar box containing her mother's remains. It sat where she had left it, untouched on the flat stone near the fire pit. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Come on, Ash," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Let's go for a walk, clear our heads." The dog followed willingly as Sophie hiked along the ridge, both of them alert to every sound in the forest. The September air was crisp, the sky a perfect blue. In daylight, last night's fears seemed almost foolish. Almost. They rounded a bend in the trail and Ash stopped abruptly, refusing to continue. The path ahead looked identical to what they'd been following, dirt trail winding between fir and pine, but the dog would not budge. "What's wrong, boy?" Sophie coaxed, but Ash backed away, whining. Sophie hesitated, looking down the seemingly innocent trail. There was nothing visibly threatening, yet Ash's reaction was unmistakable. She thought of her mother's journal entry, spirit lines invisible to human eyes but clear as fences to the creatures who know better. "Okay," she conceded. "We'll go back." They returned along the ridge, Sophie lost in thought. She was halfway to her campsite when she realized Ash was no longer beside her. She turned to see the dog standing 30 yards back, watching her with those intense, mismatched eyes. "Ash? Come on, boy." The dog turned and vanished into the trees. "Ash!" Sophie called, but there was no response. She continued to her camp, alone, telling herself the dog was wild after all. It had never been hers to keep. But as she approached her tent, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her carefully organized campsite had been methodically rearranged. Her cooking pot hung from a nearby branch. Her backpack had been moved from inside the tent to beside the fire pit, its contents partially unpacked. And the small wooden box that held her mother's ashes was gone. No, no, no. Sophie's voice cracked as she frantically searched her campsite. She upended her backpack, checked beneath her tent, and scanned the surrounding area. But the cedar box remained missing. Panic rose in her throat, sharp and metallic. "It's just a bear," she told herself, though she knew bears didn't neatly hang cooking pots from branches or selectively take only one item. Or maybe I moved it myself. Maybe I'm sleepwalking. The thought was almost more disturbing than the alternative. Was grief finally fracturing her mind? Had the isolation accelerated something that had been building since her mother's death? Since Mark walked out? A soft whine drew her attention. Ash had returned, watching her from the edge of the clearing, his mismatched eyes tracking her movements. "Where did you go?" she asked, anger and relief battling in her voice. The dog approached cautiously, nudging her hand with his muzzle, then turned and looked pointedly into the forest. "Do you know where it is?" "The box?" Ash walked a few paces toward the trees, then looked back at her expectantly. "Okay," Sophie said, grabbing her knife. "Show me." The dog led her deeper into the forest, away from the trail, moving with purpose despite his injured flank. Sophie struggled to keep up as they wove between ancient firs and over-fallen logs. Just as she was about to call out for him to slow down, Ash stopped in a small clearing. At its center lay the stone ring Sophie had discovered earlier, or one identical to it. This one was fully exposed, the stones arranged in a perfect circle, perhaps 6 feet in diameter. And inside the ring— "Oh my God," Sophie whispered. Her mother's ashes had been scattered in a precise spiral pattern, starting from the center of the circle and expanding outward. The cedar box lay open at the spiral's heart, empty. It was too deliberate to be animal activity, too strange to be human. Mischief. Sophie knelt outside the stone boundary, unable to process what she was seeing. Who would do this? Why? Her throat tightened with a mixture of grief and violation. Ash whined again, pawing anxiously at the ground but refusing to step inside the ring. "It's okay," Sophie said, more to herself than to the dog. I'll collect what I can." But as she reached across the stone boundary, Ash barked sharply, startling her. The dog's hackles rose, and he positioned himself between Sophie and the circle, clearly agitated. "It's just stones, Ash," she said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She tried to move around him, but Ash blocked her path again, growling now, not at her but at the circle itself. The intensity in his eyes gave her pause. She remembered her mother's journal. The stone circles mark safe ground, not for us, but from us. Sophie backed away. "Okay, boy, we'll leave it for now." They returned to camp in silence, the sun already lowering behind the mountains. Sophie rebuilt her fire larger than before, finding comfort in the mundane task. As daylight faded, she carefully arranged her sleeping bag closer to the flames and pulled out her mother's journal, searching for answers. Several pages in, she found an entry that made her pulse quicken. May 3rd, 2020, Elder Mitchell passed last night. Before he went, he spoke of the Guardians again. "The fire keeps them at bay," he told me. "They can't cross the light." When I asked who they were, he smiled that cryptic smile. The old ones, the watchers, the ones who were here first and will be here last. He gave me his pendant. Said I'd need it someday. May 4th, 2020. Tested Mitchell's theory about the firelight. Spent the night at the upper ridge. Something moved beyond the flames. Just shadows, but deliberate. Watching. The pendant grew warm against my skin. I think I understand now. Not malevolence, but territoriality. We're the intruders here. Sophie looked up from the journal, staring into the flickering flames. Her mother had always been drawn to indigenous knowledge, had spent years documenting traditional ecological practices throughout the Pacific Northwest. But this was different. This sounded like genuine belief in something supernatural. The fire popped suddenly, sparks spiraling upward. Sophie flinched, her nerves frayed. Ash, who had been dozing nearby, lifted his head, ears forward. Just the fire, Sophie said. But the dog was already on his feet, staring into the darkness beyond the camp. The night had brought an unnatural stillness. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of Sophie's increasingly rapid breathing. Then, gradually, a fog began rolling in. Not from the valley below as might be expected, but from the forest itself, seeping between trees like a living thing. It moved against the slight breeze, defying natural patterns. That's not normal, Sophie whispered, feeding more wood to the fire. The fog thickened, muffling the firelight and dampening sound. Soon, Sophie could barely see 10 feet beyond her camp. Ash paced the perimeter of the firelight, growling intermittently at shapes that seemed to form and dissolve in the mist. There's nothing there, Sophie said, but her voice lacked conviction. The fire flickered suddenly, the flames bending horizontally as if caught in a wind, but the air remained still. They twisted, stretched, then righted themselves, taller and brighter than before. Ash's growl deepened, his body rigid with tension. In the dense fog beyond the firelight, something moved. Not the random shifting of mist, but a deliberate motion. Tall, vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow in its proportions. Sophie reached for her knife, heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called, voice steadier than she felt. Silence answered her, heavy and expectant. Then a sound emerged from the fog, a rhythmic clicking like stone against stone or bone against bone. It circled the camp slowly, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. Ash's growls became frantic, his teeth bared as he faced the sound. Then abruptly, the clicking stopped. Ash went silent too, ears flat against his head, tail tucked. For one terrible moment, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Sophie heard her name whispered from the darkness, not a stranger's voice, but one she knew intimately, her mother's voice. "Sophie, the fire. Keep the fire." "Mom?" Sophie gasped, stumbling to her feet. "Mom, is that you?" Ash barked sharply, breaking the spell. The fog began to recede as suddenly as it had appeared, withdrawing into the trees. Within minutes, the night cleared, stars visible once more. The only evidence of the strange event was Sophie's racing pulse and the wild look in Ash's eyes. That night, Sophie dreamed of her mother walking through a misty forest, a pendant glowing at her throat. She kept looking over her shoulder, calling warnings that Sophie couldn't quite hear. The dream shifted, and Sophie stood inside a stone circle while shadowy figures moved just beyond its boundary, reaching with impossibly long fingers that stopped at the edge of the stones as if meeting an invisible wall. She woke with a gasp, the dream still vivid. Pale pre-dawn light filtered through the tent fabric. Something felt wrong. The air smelled different, earthy and sharp like ozone after lightning. Sophie unzipped her sleeping bag and froze. Her tent floor was marked with 3 parallel lines, claw marks identical to those she'd found on the tree. But these weren't random. They formed a complete circle around where she had slept, enclosing her like a protective boundary, or a target. Heart pounding, Sophie crawled from her tent. The fire had gone out completely, not even embers remaining in the pit. That was impossible. She'd banked it carefully before sleep, and there had been enough fuel to smolder until morning. The campsite was still and silent. No birds called, no insects hummed. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned the ridge. Ash was nowhere to be seen. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ash? She called softly, then louder. Ash. No answering bark came. Sophie was alone. She knelt to examine the fire pit, trying to understand how it could have extinguished so completely. The wood was cold to the touch, the ashes undisturbed by wind, as if the fire had been carefully, deliberately smothered. A branch snapped in the forest. Sophie whirled toward the sound, knife in hand. At the edge of the clearing stood Ash, watching her with unnervingly steady eyes. But something had changed in him overnight. His posture was different, more confident, almost regal. And around his neck was a thin leather cord that hadn't been there before. Ash? Sophie said uncertainly. What's that around your neck? The dog approached slowly, allowing her to see what hung from the cord. A small stone pendant carved with intricate symbols that matched those in her mother's journal sketches. Sophie reached for it with trembling fingers. Where did you get this? The pendant was warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. As she held it, memories surfaced. Her mother wearing this same pendant on their last hike together, Callie's fingers often touching it absently as they walked. Her mother's voice saying, "Sometimes protection finds us when we need it most." Sophie looked into Ash's mismatched eyes, suddenly understanding that the dog's appearance in her camp had not been coincidence. Whether guided by some strange instinct or something more inexplicable, Ash had brought her mother's pendant back to her. And as the first rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains, illuminating the pendant in her palm, Sophie realized with absolute certainty that whatever had visited her camp in the night would return when darkness fell again. Sophie held her mother's pendant, the stone warm against her palm despite the cool morning air. She slipped the cord around her neck, the weight of it settling against her collarbone like a memory. Ash watched her with those mismatched eyes, one amber, one pale as winter, something knowing in his gaze. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, half to herself, half to the dog. The events of the past 2 days defied rational explanation. The strange fog, her mother's voice in the darkness, the claw marks encircling her sleeping bag. All of it tugged at the edges of her sanity. Sophie pulled her mother's old trail map from her pack, hands trembling slightly. There had to be someone else in these mountains, someone who could verify what she was experiencing, or confirm that grief had finally fractured her mind. The map showed a ranger station 3 miles north along the ridge. Sophie hadn't planned to encounter anyone on this trip, had specifically chosen this remote area to avoid human contact. But now the thought of another person, another voice besides the one in her head, felt like salvation. "Come on, Ash," she said, gathering essential supplies in her day pack. "We're going to find some help." The dog hesitated, looking toward the forest where they'd found the stone circle and her mother's ashes. The pendant at Sophie's throat pulsed with subtle warmth. "We'll come back," she promised, though she wasn't entirely sure she meant it. The hike along the ridge was arduous, the trail overgrown in places as if rarely used. Sophie checked her compass frequently, confirming their northward progress, Ash trotting ahead and occasionally circling back as if to ensure she followed. By mid-morning, they crested a hill, and the ranger station came into view, a small wooden structure nestled against the tree line. No smoke rose from its stone chimney, no movement visible through its windows. "Hello?" Sophie called as they approached. "Ranger? Anyone here?" Silence answered her. The station appeared long abandoned, its wooden steps weathered gray, its windows clouded with dust and pollen. Sophie's heart sank. She'd pinned her hopes on finding someone, anyone, who might ground her in reality. Let's check inside anyway, she said to Ash, approaching the cabin. The door creaked open at her touch, swinging inward to reveal a Spartan. Interior: a wooden desk, a small cot, a pot-bellied stove in one corner. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed except for what looked like animal tracks across the floor. So much for rescue, Sophie muttered, disappointment bitter in her throat. A sharp bark from Ash drew her attention. The dog stood by the desk, pawing at something on its surface. Sophie moved closer and found a radio unit, its black metal casing contrasting with the dusty wood. Unlike everything else in the cabin, the radio showed signs of recent use. Fingerprints in the dust, a notepad beside it with fresh pencil marks. Someone had been here and not long ago. Sophie reached for the handset, her pulse quickening. The on switch clicked beneath her finger, and the unit hummed to life. Static filled the small cabin. "Hello?" she said into the handset. "Is anyone receiving? This is Sophie Mercer at..." She glanced at the map. "Ridgepoint Station. Can anyone hear me?" The static continued, uninterrupted. Sophie tried again, desperation edging into her voice. "Please, if anyone's out there, I need help." The static crackled, shifted, then resolved into a voice, faint but unmistakably human. "Receiving you, Ridgepoint. This is Ranger Brower at North Basin. Over." Relief flooded through Sophie. "Yes, I can hear you. I'm at Ridgepoint." As she hesitated, unsure how to explain her situation without sounding unhinged. "I'm camping alone and experiencing some concerning events." The radio crackled again, the voice cutting in and out. "Reception poor, conditions changing, nature of emergency?" "I'm not sure it's an emergency exactly," Sophie replied, though the claw marks around her sleeping bag suggested otherwise. "But strange things are happening. I found a wounded dog and there's something in the woods at night." The static intensified, drowning out her words. When it cleared, the ranger's voice came through more urgently. "Familiar with that area? Old stories, don't leave the firelight after dark, keeps them at bay." Sophie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Keeps what at bay?" "They follow sound, drawn to voices, especially those who grieve." The pendant against her chest grew warmer, almost uncomfortably so. Outside the cabin windows, the clear day had begun to darken unnaturally, clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. "I don't understand," Sophie said, gripping the handset tighter. "Who are you talking about?" "Location confirmed. Hiking to you. Stay at camp. Maintain fire. Arriving tomorrow morning." The voice faded into increased static. Then, one final fragment broke through. "Your mother knew." The radio went dead, leaving Sophie staring at the handset. Her mother knew. The words echoed in her mind, confirming her suspicions that Callie had been more than just a casual visitor to these mountains. Whatever was happening had happened to her mother before. "We need to get back to camp," she told Ash, tucking the map away. The dog was already at the door, anxious to leave the cabin. Outside, the weather had changed dramatically. Dark clouds obscured the sun, and a heavy mist clung to the treetops. Sophie checked her compass, confirming their southward route back to camp, but as she watched, the needle began to spin erratically, whirling in complete circles before settling briefly, then spinning again. "That's impossible," she whispered, tapping the compass face. The needle continued its frantic rotation. With the compass useless, Sophie would have to navigate by landmarks and her own sense of direction. "Let's go, Ash. Stay close." They descended the ridge, the forest growing denser, and the light dimmer with each step. Sophie's unease intensified, as she realized the terrain looked unfamiliar, darker, older somehow, the trees more gnarled than she remembered from their morning journey. Movement flickered between tree trunks ahead, too large for a deer, too fluid for a bear. Sophie froze, her breath catching. A figure crossed the path perhaps 50 yards ahead, tall and elongated, moving with an unnatural grace. Its head appeared crowned with branches or perhaps antlers, its limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. It paused, as if sensing her gaze, then continued into the forest without looking back. "Did you see that?" Sophie whispered to Ash, her voice tight with fear. The dog growled low in his throat, fur bristling along his spine. More movement registered in Sophie's peripheral vision, another figure similar to the first, gliding between distant trees. "We need to run," she said, her survival instincts finally overriding curiosity and disbelief. They raced down the ridge, Sophie's heart hammering against her ribs. The forest blurred around them, the mist thickening with each step. Twice more she glimpsed those strange figures, always at a distance, always moving parallel to their path, rather than toward them, as if hurting them. When they finally broke through to the clearing where her camp stood, Sophie nearly collapsed with relief. Everything appeared undisturbed, her tent still standing, her supplies where she'd left them, but Ash wasn't beside her anymore. "Ash?" Sophie called, turning in a circle. The dog had been with her moments ago, racing through the forest at her side. "Ash!" Only silence answered her. The clearing felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Sophie approached her tent slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. That's when she noticed them, small river stones arranged in a spiral pattern around her entire campsite, dozens of them placed with mathematical precision. They formed a perfect spiral that centered on her tent, each stone positioned exactly, the same distance from the next. It was impossible. She'd been gone only a few hours. No person could have arranged so many stones so precisely in that time. Sophie knelt beside the nearest stone, remembering the spiral of her mother's ashes, in the stone circle. The pattern was identical. Trembling, she reached out to touch one of the stones, and jerked her hand back immediately. It was hot to the touch, as if it had been sitting in strong sunlight despite the overcast day. A twig snapped in the forest, behind her. Sophie whirled, knife in hand, but saw only shadows and mist between the trees. The pendant at her throat pulsed with heat, almost painful now against her skin. She frantically gathered firewood, piling it high in the fire pit. Whatever was happening, one message had come through clearly from the ranger on the radio. "Don't leave the firelight. Keeps them at bay." As the sun sank below the ridge, casting the forest into premature darkness, Sophie struck a match and lit the kindling. The fire caught quickly, flames leaping higher than natural as if eager to provide protection. She huddled close to the fire, Callie's journal clutched in one hand, her knife in the other. The strange spiral of stones encircled her position, their purpose unknown, boundary or target, protection or trap. Night fell completely, the darkness absolute beyond her firelight. Sophie strained to hear anything, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves, but the forest remained eerily silent. Only the crackle of her fire disturbed the stillness. Then at the very edge of the firelight, movement caught her eye. Ash emerged from the darkness, his fur matted with fresh blood, his injured flank now bearing new wounds. He limped toward her, growling continuously. His teeth bared not at Sophie, but at whatever lurked in the darkness behind him. The dog crossed the spiral of stones and collapsed at Sophie's feet, his body trembling with exhaustion. Something had attacked him, something that had left 4 parallel gashes across his side, the flesh torn as if by massive claws. And as the fire flickered, casting twisted shadows across the clearing, Sophie realized with cold certainty that Ash hadn't escaped his pursuers. He had led them straight to her. Sophie pressed a clean cloth against Ash's wounds, her hands shaking but determined. The dog whimpered softly but remained still, those mismatched eyes never leaving her face. "What happened to you out there?" she whispered, examining the 4 parallel gashes. They were deep but clean, as if made by something with surgical precision, rather than wild animal fury. The fire crackled behind her, unnaturally bright against the absolute darkness that had enveloped the forest. Sophie had fed it continuously through the night, abandoning any thought of sleep. Twice she'd heard that strange clicking sound circling the perimeter of her camp, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. Each time, Ash had growled in response, his body tense despite his injuries. Dawn arrived with merciful normalcy, birdsong, gentle breeze, golden light filtering through the trees. The oppressive presence that had stalked the night seemed to recede with the darkness, but the stone spiral remained around her campsite, a tangible reminder that she hadn't imagined everything. Sophie checked Ash's bandages, relieved to find the bleeding had stopped. The dog was already looking stronger, his resilience almost supernatural. He stood carefully, testing his injured leg, then moved to the edge of the clearing, looking expectantly back at her. "You want me to follow you?" Sophie asked, wary after yesterday's experiences. Ash barked once, sharp and insistent. "Okay," she conceded, gathering her knife, water bottle, and her mother's journal. The pendant still hung warm against her chest. "But we're staying within sight of camp." The dog led her to the edge of the clearing, where he paused at the boundary of the stone spiral. He looked pointedly at Sophie, then at the stones, as if waiting for her to understand something crucial. Sophie remembered how carefully he'd avoided crossing the half-buried stone ring that first day. But now he deliberately placed one paw across the spiral line, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. An invitation. A test. "You want me to cross the boundary with you," she realized aloud. The moment held weight, a choice that felt irrevocable. Sophie took a deep breath and stepped over the line of stones. Nothing happened, no flash of light, no shift in the air, but Sophie felt something subtle change, as if she'd moved from one state of being into another. Ash immediately turned and trotted into the forest, staying just close enough to keep her in sight. Sophie followed, marking their path mentally as they wound between ancient trees. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, but no less watchful. After 20 minutes of walking, they entered a clearing unlike any Sophie had seen before. Massive old-growth trees formed a perfect circle around a small glade, their branches creating a natural dome overhead. Sunlight filtered through in dappled patterns that seemed to shift and flow across the forest floor. At the center of the glade stood a structure, not quite a building, but something deliberately constructed. Weathered wooden posts formed a rough circle carved with symbols that looked eerily similar to the sketches in her mother's journal. Between the posts, arranged with obvious purpose, lay bones. Animal bones of various sizes, some clearly ancient, others more recent. "What is this place?" Sophie whispered, afraid to raise her voice. Ash walked confidently into the glade, past the bone circle, to a flat stone at its center. Resting on the stone was a small leather pouch, worn with age but carefully placed. Sophie approached cautiously, every instinct both drawing her forward and urging retreat. When she reached the stone, Ash sat beside it, watching as she carefully picked up the pouch. It was light in her hand, the leather soft with age. With trembling fingers, Sophie untied its simple drawstring. Inside lay a pendant, identical to the one around her neck. A small, smooth stone etched with spiral patterns and ancient symbols. But this one was older, the cord frayed and discolored with time. Sophie held it in her palm, something stirring in her memory. A day long ago, walking these very woods with her mother. She'd been 12, gangly and unsure, still reeling from her father's departure. Callie had brought her to these mountains to reconnect with what matters, as she'd put it. The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. They had stopped to rest, and Sophie had wandered a few yards into the trees, following a butterfly. She'd found a clearing much like this one, with strange markings on the trees, and voices, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking words she couldn't understand but somehow recognized. She'd run back to her mother, frightened. And Callie hadn't been surprised. She'd knelt down, looked into Sophie's eyes, and said something Sophie had forgotten until this moment. "They recognized you. You're part of this place just like I am." The pendant in her palm grew warm, matching the temperature of the one against her throat. Sophie looked around the glade with new understanding. This wasn't some random sight she'd stumbled upon. Her mother had known about this place, had been connected to it somehow, and now Sophie was being drawn into the same connection. As she stood there, The quality of light in the glade began to change. The dappled sunlight dimmed, though when Sophie glanced upward, she could see no clouds through the canopy. The trees themselves seemed to shift, their trunks bending inward slightly, branches lowering as if to enclose the space more completely. "Ash?" Sophie called, sudden fear tightening her throat. "We should go." The dog didn't move, his attention fixed on something beyond the wooden posts. Sophie turned to follow his gaze and froze. The forest beyond the glade had changed. The paths they'd followed to get here were gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and trees that hadn't been there before. "That's impossible," she whispered, circling the glade. Every direction looked equally unfamiliar, the forest rearranging itself like a living puzzle. Then she heard it, her name whispered softly from behind a nearby tree. "Sophie." She spun toward the sound, knife raised. Nothing was there. "Sophie." This time from the opposite direction, the voice neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Another whisper came from behind her, then another from her left, her name repeated in a growing chorus that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. The voices surrounded her, some sounding almost like her mother's, others entirely alien. The pendant at her throat burned against her skin. Sophie clutched it instinctively, and in that moment, the second pendant in her palm flared with equal heat. The two stones resonated together, vibrating with a frequency she could feel in her bones. The chorus of whispers abruptly ceased. In the silence that followed, Sophie heard a single voice, her mother's voice, clear and unmistakable. "The threshold opens both ways, Sophie. You must choose which side you stand on." The forest around the glade shimmered like heat rising from pavement. Through this distortion, Sophie glimpsed paths appearing and disappearing, the geography of the forest fluctuating like a living thing. She wasn't trapped. She was being shown possibilities, ways through. She realized with sudden clarity that she wasn't being stalked by the forest. She was being guided by it, or by something within it. The clicking sounds, the spiral stones, even Ash's appearance, all of it had been leading her here, to this moment of understanding. Sophie looked down at the two pendants, one old, one newer, both identical in design. With a certainty that came from somewhere beyond rational thought, she placed the older pendant back on the stone where she had found it. It belonged here, in this place of threshold and boundary. The moment the pendant touched the stone, the forest stabilized, the light strengthened, and a clear path appeared before her. Not the one they had followed to the glade, but a new route that seemed to beckon. "This way?" she asked Ash. The dog rose and trotted to the path, looking back expectantly. Sophie followed, the pendant against her chest now cool and comfortable as if it had recognized its purpose. The path led them through unfamiliar terrain. Ancient trees gave way to younger growth, dense undergrowth thinned to navigable forest floor. Sophie had the distinct sense of moving through spaces that existed simultaneously, layered atop one another like transparent pages in a book. As they walked, the whispers returned, but gentler now, almost musical. They no longer simply repeated her name but spoke fragments of sentences in languages Sophie didn't recognize, yet somehow their meaning filtered through. Threshold walker, firekeeper, daughter of the boundary. The path twisted suddenly, and Sophie found herself facing a massive Douglas fir she recognized, the one that stood at the edge of her campsite. Somehow they had traveled back, though not by any route she could map in her mind. As she stepped into the clearing, relief washed over her. Her tent still stood, her campfire smoldered with embers ready to be revived. The stone spiral remained, but now she saw it not as a threat, but as a demarcation, a boundary between worlds. Movement near her tent caught her attention. A man rose from where he'd been crouched, examining the stone spiral. Tall, weathered, dressed in the olive-green uniform of a forest ranger, he turned toward her with an expression of mingled relief and profound unease. "Sophie Mercer?" he asked, his voice matching the one she'd heard on the radio. "I'm Elias Brower," Thank God you're all right." His eyes darted from her to Ash, then to the forest behind them. "We need to talk. I saw something out there. Something that shouldn't exist." "You might want to sit down for this," Ranger Elias Brower said, his weathered face grave in the afternoon light. He was older than Sophie had expected, mid-40s perhaps, with salt and pepper hair cropped short and eyes that had seen too much. "I've been a ranger in these mountains for 17 years, and I've never been sure if what I'm about to tell you is madness or truth." Sophie added more wood to her rekindled fire, though daylight still bathed the clearing. Ash lay at her feet, his body pressed against her legs, alert despite his injuries. "After what I've seen, I'm ready to believe just about anything," Sophie said. Elias nodded, his gaze drifting to the perfect spiral of stones encircling her campsite. "Your mother was Callie Mercer, wasn't she? The botanist?" Sophie's breath caught. "You knew her?" "We crossed paths several times over the years. She was interested in the old stories about these mountains. At first I thought she was just collecting folklore for academic purposes." He paused, studying Sophie's face. "But it was more than that, wasn't it?" "I'm starting to think so," Sophie replied, touching the pendant at her throat. "What do you know about these guardians?" Elias sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "The local tribes have stories going back centuries. They say these mountains are a threshold between worlds, protected by entities they call the Watchers. Not quite spirits, not quite physical beings. Something in between." He poked at the fire with a stick, avoiding her gaze. "Most rangers hear these stories and chalk them up to superstition. I did too at first. But then the disappearances started." "Disappearances?" Sophie's mouth went dry. "Over the past 20 years, 5 solo hikers have vanished in this specific area. 2 were eventually found." His voice dropped. "They were in perfect circles of ash. No signs of injury, no cause of death the medical examiner could determine. They just stopped living." Ash growled softly, his eyes fixed on the forest beyond the stone spiral. "The locals say the Watchers are drawn to certain people. Those who grieve, those who stand at emotional crossroads, the vulnerable." Elias's eyes met hers. "People like you, Sophie." The words landed with the weight of truth. Her recent divorce, her mother's death. She was exactly the kind of person these entities would be drawn to, if the legends were real. "What changed your mind?" Sophie asked. "What made you start believing?" Elias was silent for a long moment. 3 years ago, I was doing a routine patrol in the northern section. Got caught in a storm, took shelter in a cave. Something visited me that night. I never saw it clearly, just shadows moving against shadows. But it left these." He rolled up his sleeve to reveal 3 parallel scars running from wrist to elbow, identical to the claw marks Sophie had found on the tree, on her tent floor, on Ash's flank. I told myself it was a bear, or maybe I'd cut myself in the dark, but deep down I knew. His eyes drifted to Ash. "And that's no ordinary dog. Look at its eyes." Sophie glanced down at Ash, seeing again the strange intelligence in those mismatched eyes. One amber, one pale as moonlight. "The legends mention guardians of a different sort," Elias continued. "Sentinels that walk the boundary between worlds, sometimes taking animal form to guide or protect those who belong to the threshold." "Belong?" Sophie repeated. "Some people are connected to these places whether they know it or not." Elias nodded toward her pendant. "Your mother understood that connection. I think she was preparing you in her way." Sophie's fingers closed around the pendant. "There have been incidents. Stones arranged in spirals, strange sounds at night, my mother's ashes scattered in a pattern, and I found a shrine in the forest with symbols that match the ones my mother drew." Elias's face paled. "Then it's already begun. The testing." "Testing?" "The Watchers don't just randomly attack. They test those who enter their territory, especially those with potential connections to the threshold. If you've been led to a shrine, if you're hearing voices." He trailed off, his expression grim. "We need to prepare before nightfall." They worked quickly, methodically. Elias produced a small pouch of salt from his pack, carefully laying a white line just inside the stone spiral. "Old boundary magic," he explained. "Probably useless, but it can't hurt." Sophie gathered extra wood, building the fire higher than before. She positioned her tent closer to the flames, creating a tight defensive perimeter. All the while, Ash paced the edge of the stone spiral, refusing to stray more than a few feet from Sophie's side. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Sophie retrieved her mother's journal. "There might be something in here that can help us," she said, flipping through the pages. "My mother spent years studying these mountains, these legends." Elias glanced up from where he was arranging river stones in smaller circles around the fire. "What does it say?" Sophie found an entry dated just months before her mother's diagnosis. October 17th, 2020. "The spiral is the key. It appears everywhere in the threshold places, in stone arrangements, in growth patterns, in the very movement of the watchers themselves. Not a circle, which merely contains, but a spiral, which connects center to periphery. Inward and outward flow. Elder Mitchell said the words must be spoken at the threshold moment. Neither day nor night, but the breath between." "The threshold moment," Sophie murmured. "Twilight." The sun sank lower, the quality of light shifting from gold to deep amber. Sophie felt Ash press against her legs, a continuous low growl rumbling from his chest. The forest beyond their camp had gone silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. "It's coming," Elias said quietly, checking his own knife. "Whatever you're going to do, now's the time." Sophie opened the journal to the page where her mother had sketched the pendant symbols, her handwriting documenting phonetic transcriptions beneath each one. "I think I need to read these," Sophie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My mother wrote that words hold power at the threshold." Elias nodded, his face tense in the firelight. "Do it." Sophie began to read aloud, the unfamiliar syllables awkward on her tongue. The language was unlike anything she knew, guttural yet flowing, ancient yet somehow familiar, as if it resided in the oldest parts of her brain. As she spoke, the air in the clearing thickened. The fire responded to each phrase, flames leaping, higher then lower, dancing in patterns that matched the rhythm of the words. From the surrounding forest came answering sounds, not echoes but responses, as if the trees themselves were participating in some ancient dialogue. Ash's growl intensified, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the firelight. The stone spiral around. Their camp began to glow faintly, each stone emitting a pale blue luminescence that strengthened with every word Sophie read. "Keep going," Elias urged, his voice tight with tension. "Something's happening." Sophie continued reading, feeling the pendant grow hot against her skin. The final words of the passage resonated through the clearing like the toll of a distant bell. The fire flared suddenly, impossibly bright, forcing them to shield their eyes. When the light stabilized, the stones of the spiral glowed like blue stars embedded in the earth, forming a complete boundary around their camp. Beyond this circle of light, darkness had fallen absolute and impenetrable. But within that darkness, something moved. Tall, fluid shapes sliding between trees, their movements too smooth to be human, too deliberate to be animal. The clicking sound began again, bone against bone, stone against stone, a rhythmic communication that surrounded the camp completely. "They're here," Elias whispered, moving closer to the fire. "Stay inside the spiral." Ash positioned himself between Sophie and the darkness, his body rigid with tension. The fire began to dim despite the ample fuel, as if something were drawing the light and heat from it. "The fire's failing," Sophie said, frantically adding more wood. The flames caught but burned low, struggling against an invisible force. "Something's interfering," Elias replied, scanning the darkness. "They're testing the boundaries." In the dim light, Sophie could see his face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling air. His ranger's composure was cracking, fear bleeding through. "I've seen them before from a distance," he said, voice barely audible. But never this close, never this many. The clicking intensified, now interspersed with a sound like breathing. Deep, resonant inhalations that seemed to pull at the very air in their lungs. The fire dimmed further, the blue glow of the stones providing the only reliable light. "We need to strengthen the boundary," Sophie said, consulting the journal again. Her fingers trembled, but her voice remained steady as she found another passage and began to read. The words felt more natural this time, as if the language were awakening some dormant knowledge within her. As she read, the stone pendant at her throat pulsed with light, matching the glow of the spiral stones. The fire stabilized, then strengthened, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Elias stared at her with a mixture of awe and fear. "You're not just connected to this place," he said slowly. "You're part of its power." Before Sophie could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing. One of the glowing stones in the spiral had split in two, its light flickering and dying. Through this gap in their defense, darkness began to seep in like black water. "They're breaking through," Elias said, knife raised. "We need to close that breach." The clicking sounds converged toward the broken stone, the darkness beyond it condensing into a shape too fluid to define but undeniably present. Ash lunged toward it, barking furiously, but stopped short of crossing the boundary, as if unwilling, or unable to leave the protected space. "I need to reset the stone," Elias said, already moving toward the breach. "Keep reading, keep the fire going." "Elias, don't," Sophie began, but he was already stepping over the salt line, reaching for the broken stone. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Elias knelt, fingers closing around the fractured pieces of stone. Then darkness surged up like a wave, enveloping his arm, his shoulder, his body. He had time for one startled cry before an invisible force yanked him backward out of the circle into the impenetrable black beyond. "Elias!" Sophie screamed, lunging forward. Ash blocked her path, teeth bared, forcing her back toward the fire. Beyond the boundary, nothing moved. No sound came from the spot where Elias had vanished. Only the darkness, watching, waiting, and the clicking sounds now formed into what Sophie suddenly horribly recognized as laughter. "Elias!" Sophie's scream tore through the night, met only by that terrible clicking laughter from the darkness. She struggled against Ash's blocking form, desperate to follow the ranger. "Let me go! We have to help him!" The dog held firm, growling not at Sophie but at the breach in the stone spiral where Elias had vanished. Beyond their circle of fading, firelight movement rippled through the absolute darkness, tall fluid shapes sliding between trees, circling, watching. Then came the sound that broke Sophie's restraint. Elias's voice, a distant scream of pain that cut off abruptly. Ash's momentary distraction was all she needed. Sophie vaulted past the dog and through the gap in the spiral, her mother's pendant burning against her skin as she crossed the boundary. The darkness swallowed her immediately, a tangible thing that pressed against her eyes and skin. Sophie stumbled forward, guided only by the distant glow of her campfire behind her, and the residual heat of the pendant. "Elias!" she called, her voice muffled as if the darkness itself absorbed sound. No answer came. Sophie fumbled with her flashlight, clicking it on only to find the beam severely diminished, barely penetrating a few feet ahead of her. She swept, it in an arc, searching for any sign of the ranger. The beam caught a metallic reflection, Elias's radio lying on the forest floor beside a dark smear that could only be blood. Sophie moved toward it, fighting the oppressive weight of the darkness. As she reached for the radio, a sound came from directly behind her, that same bone-deep clicking now so close she could feel its vibration against her spine. Sophie whirled, knife raised, but the flashlight beam showed nothing. Yet she knew with absolute certainty that something stood there, just beyond the reach of her diminished light. A low bark cut through the darkness. Ash, calling from the campsite. The dog stood at the boundary breach, his form backlit by the dying fire. Those mismatched eyes reflecting light like twin moons. Sophie backed toward him, clutching the radio, keeping her knife extended toward the unseen presence. When she reached the broken stone boundary, She hesitated. Something held her back, some instinct that whispered this was her last chance to retreat, to leave these mountains and never return. Ash whined urgently, pawing at the ground inside the circle. Sophie took a deep breath and stepped back across the boundary. Immediately, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, though she could still feel it watching from beyond the spiral stones. "He's gone," she said, voice breaking as she examined the blood on her fingers. "I should have stopped him." Ash nudged her hand, then turned and trotted toward her tent. He pawed at her backpack, looking back at her with clear intent. "What is it?" Sophie asked, following. The dog continued pawing at the pack until Sophie opened it. Inside, beneath her spare clothes and emergency supplies, lay the second container of her mother's ashes, a twin to the one that had been taken and scattered in the stone circle in the forest. Sophie stared at it, understanding dawning. "The shrine in the woods. You want me to go there?" Ash barked once, definitively. "But the fire..." Sophie glanced at their dwindling protection. The stone still glowed, but dimmer now, and the gap remained where one had broken. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. They couldn't stay here. The boundary was broken, the fire failing. Their only hope lay in action, in confronting whatever force haunted these woods on its own terms. In finishing what her mother had started. "We need to move quickly," Sophie said, gathering essential supplies. Her knife, the journal, a torch fashioned from a branch wrapped in fuel-soaked cloth. She tucked the container of ashes into her jacket and lit the torch from the fire. "Ready?" she asked Ash. The dog moved to the broken boundary and paused, waiting. Sophie took a deep breath, touched the pendant at her throat, and crossed the line beside him. This time the darkness seemed less absolute, as if her purpose somehow held it at bay. Her torch burned steadily, illuminating a path that Sophie wasn't entirely sure had been there moments before. Ash trotted ahead, looking back frequently to ensure she followed. They moved through the forest with eerie speed, as if distance itself had become compressed. Sophie heard the clicking sounds tracking them, keeping pace but never approaching. Not chasing, she realized. Escorting. The shrine clearing emerged. Before them suddenly, the ancient wooden posts dark against the night sky. But the space had transformed since her last visit. The symbols carved into the posts now glowed with faint blue light, identical to the stones in the spiral. The bone circle at the center emitted a subtle luminescence, creating a perfect boundary around the flat stone where she'd found the older pendant. Ash walked directly to this stone and sat beside it, waiting. Sophie approached slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. This was why she'd come to these mountains, not just to scatter her mother's ashes, but to assume her place in something ancient and ongoing. She'd fled to the wilderness seeking isolation, but what she'd found instead was connection. To her mother, to this land, to forces older than human understanding. She placed the container of ashes on the stone and opened her mother's journal, to a page she'd noticed earlier but hadn't fully comprehended. The sentinel assumes responsibility through sacrifice and succession. Ash to ash, blood to threshold, grief to purpose. The spiral closes only to open again. To end the hunting, one must become the guardian. The words resonated with truth Sophie felt but couldn't yet articulate. She opened the container and carefully poured her mother's ashes onto the stone, using her fingers to arrange them in the same spiral pattern she'd seen before. As she worked, the pendant at her throat grew warmer, pulsing with each heartbeat. Around the clearing, the darkness gathered and condensed, taking on partial forms that flickered in and out of visibility. Tall, elongated figures with too many joints, crowned with branching antlers or perhaps elongated fingers. They never fully materialized, remaining in that unsettling state between absence and presence. The clicking sound surrounded her now, rising and falling in complex patterns that almost resembled language. Sophie felt strangely calm despite the terror that should have overwhelmed her. She was where she needed to be, doing what needed to be done. When the ash spiral was complete, Sophie consulted the journal again, finding the words her mother had transcribed. She began to read them aloud, her voice steady in the night air. The language felt natural on her tongue now, as if she'd always known it but forgotten. With each phrase, the symbols glowed brighter. The partial entities moved closer, their forms flickering more rapidly, more substantially. Ash remained motionless beside the stone, watching Sophie with absolute trust in those mismatched eyes. Sophie reached the final passage in the journal, her mother's last entry. The bond requires willingness. The threshold demands a token. What flows within must be offered freely. Without hesitation, Sophie drew her knife across her palm. The cut was shallow but effective, blood welling up in a thin line. She pressed her bleeding hand to the ash spiral on the stone. "I accept this role," she said, knowing somehow these were the right words. "I accept this boundary. I offer myself as sentinel." For a moment, nothing happened. Then her blood and her mother's ashes began to move together, merging and flowing into new patterns on the stone's surface. The pendant at her throat flared with brilliant blue light, matched by every symbol on every post around the clearing. The entities fully manifested then, towering figures of shadow and substance, their forms constantly shifting but unmistakably present. They formed a circle around Sophie, not threatening now but observant, assessing. The largest of them stepped forward, a being of impossible angles and fluid movement. It extended a limb that was neither arm nor branch toward Sophie's face. She held her ground, neither retreating nor advancing, simply accepting. The entity touched her forehead with what might have been a finger. Ice and fire raced through Sophie's body simultaneously. Visions flooded her mind, ancient forests, stone circles, generations of guardians standing watch at the threshold between worlds. She saw her mother among them, accepting the same role years ago. She saw herself continuing the line of sentinels stretching back before recorded history. As suddenly as it had appeared, the entity withdrew. One by one, the watchers faded back into the darkness, their clicking communication growing fainter, until silence reclaimed the forest. The glowing symbols dimmed but didn't extinguish completely, now a permanent part of Sophie's perception. Sophie looked down at her bleeding palm. The wound had sealed itself, leaving a spiral scar in its place, a perfect match to the pattern on her pendant. She felt different, more connected to the forest around her. She could sense the boundaries now, the places where the world thinned and thickened, the paths between realities. Ash stood and pressed against her leg, no longer tense or alert, but calm, his purpose fulfilled. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, the same blue as the symbols on the posts. "It's done, isn't it?" Sophie asked, her voice sounding different to her own ears, deeper, more resonant. The forest answered with absolute stillness. Not the unnatural silence of fear, but the perfect quiet of balance restored. Sophie understood now what her mother had known, what she had been preparing her for. The Watchers weren't evil. They were guardians of ancient boundaries, and they required human counterparts, human sentinels to maintain the balance between worlds. Callie had been one such sentinel. Now Sophie would continue her work. As dawn approached, Sophie made her way back to her camp, Ash trotting beside her. The forest felt different now, not threatening, but familiar, as if she had always known its secret paths and hidden places. The broken stone in the spiral had mended itself, the boundary complete once more. Sophie collapsed beside her rekindled fire, emotionally and physically exhausted but strangely at peace. Sleep claimed her immediately, dreamless and deep. She woke to the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The forest looked ordinary again, though Sophie could still see the faint glow of the boundary stones if she looked at them from the corner of her eye. Ash lay beside her, watching the tree line with calm vigilance. Something had fundamentally changed in both of them. As Sophie stretched, a sound caught her attention. A faint crackling from the radio she'd recovered where Elias had vanished. She grabbed it, adjusting the dial. Through heavy static, a voice emerged, distant but unmistakable. "Sophie, can you hear me? Need help? The other side?" Elias was alive, somewhere beyond the threshold, and Sophie, newly made sentinel of the boundary, was perhaps the only one who could find him. Sophie pressed the radio transmit button, her heart racing. "Elias, can you hear me? Where are you?" Only static answered. The brief moment of connection, lost. She adjusted dials, tried again, but Elias's voice didn't return. The radio fell silent in her hands. "He's alive," she whispered to Ash, who watched her with those knowing, mismatched eyes. "Somewhere. Beyond." The dog gave a soft whine, neither confirmation nor denial. Sophie set the radio down and gazed around her campsite with new awareness. Everything looked ordinary in the morning light. Her tent, her supplies, the stone circle, but she could see the subtle glow of energies she'd been blind to before. The boundaries, the thresholds, the places where reality grew thin. Sophie knew what she needed to do. Not today. She wasn't ready yet to cross fully to the other side, to search for Elias in the Watcher's domain. But she would return. This was only the beginning of her responsibility as Sentinel. "We need to prepare the site," she told Ash, who seemed to understand perfectly. Sophie spent the morning redrawing the boundary, no longer guided by fear but by knowledge. She carefully repositioned stones that had been slightly misaligned, completing the spiral pattern with deliberate precision. Each stone she placed hummed, faintly beneath her fingers, recognizing her touch as that of a threshold guardian. Near midday, she knelt beside her fire pit and dug a small hole in its center. From around her neck, she removed her mother's pendant. "Not goodbye," she murmured, pressing the carved stone into the earth. "Just returning you to where you belong." She covered the pendant with soil and rebuilt the fire pit above it, creating a permanent anchor for the boundary magic. As she worked, she sensed the Watchers in the forest, not threatening now but observant, acknowledging her role in the ancient balance. When the campsite was properly prepared, Sophie gathered her sketchpad and her mother's journal. She had one more task, before she could leave these mountains. "Come on, Ash," she said, "one last visit to the shrine." They traveled the forest paths with easy familiarity, Sophie now aware of the subtle markers she'd missed before. Arrangements of stones, patterns of lichen on tree trunks, the way certain branches bent to indicate threshold points. The journey to the shrine clearing took half the time it had before, the forest seeming to fold space around her. Recognizing her right to pass, the shrine stood peaceful in dappled sunlight, the wooden posts now ordinary again to casual observation. But Sophie could see the faint blue energy flowing through the carved symbols, maintaining the boundary that had existed for centuries. She placed her mother's journal on the central stone, alongside her own sketches from the past few days. Images of the stone circles, the shrine, and several detailed drawings of Ash. A record for whoever might come next, just as her mother had left records for her. "I'll be back," she promised the clearing. "But I have a life to return to first, a life to rebuild." Sophie touched the spiral scar on her palm, still vivid against her skin. The mark of her covenant with this place wouldn't fade with distance. Part of her would always remain connected to these mountains, to the threshold, to the Watchers beyond. As they began the long hike back toward the trailhead, Sophie felt a strange lightness. The grief that had driven her to these mountains hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. Her mother's death, her failed marriage, these wounds had scarred over, becoming part of the texture of her being rather than raw, bleeding gaps. "I came here broken," she told Ash as they walked. "I'm leaving different." The dog padded beside her silently, his injuries from the previous night seemingly healed, his movements fluid and powerful. Sophie had stopped questioning his nature, whether guardian spirit in animal form or simply an extraordinary creature. Drawn to the threshold, Ash had guided her toward her destiny, and she owed him her life. Midway down the trail, they encountered another hiker, a woman perhaps Sophie's age, moving upward with determined steps. Something in her demeanor struck Sophie immediately, a familiar tension and emotional rawness barely contained beneath a veneer of composure. Grief, recognized grief. Their eyes met briefly as they passed on the narrow trail. Sophie saw recognition flicker across the woman's face, not of Sophie herself, but of something she carried within her. The hiker looked quickly away, continuing, upward without speaking. Sophie didn't call out or warn her. The mountains would test this woman as they had tested Sophie, and she would either find her own path or retreat. That was the way of threshold places. The final mile to the trailhead felt like crossing from one life into another. With each step, Sophie became more aware of her dual nature now. Part ordinary woman, part threshold guardian. The forest was releasing her back into the mundane world, but not completely. Never completely. When the parking area came into view, her dusty SUV waiting where she'd left it days ago, Sophie turned to Ash. The dog had stopped several yards back, sitting perfectly still at the edge of the true forest. "You're not coming with me, are you?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Ash's mismatched eyes held hers steadily, conveying what words could not. His purpose with her was complete for now. He belonged to the threshold, to the mountains. Sophie knelt and held out her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me, for showing me the way." The dog approached one last time, pressing his muzzle briefly against her palm against the spiral scar. Then he turned and trotted back up the trail, his form seeming to blur slightly among the dappled shadows. Sophie didn't call him back. Some partings were necessary. Some bonds transcended physical proximity. She would see Ash again when she returned to fulfill her duties as sentinel. At her car, Sophie stowed her pack and slid behind the wheel. Her old life awaited, her apartment in Portland, her illustration work, the ordinary rhythms of the world. But she would return to them changed, carrying the knowledge of what existed beyond the Firelight's edge. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then stalled. Sophie tried again with the same result, a momentary frustration, breaking through her newfound calm. "Come on," she muttered, turning the key a third time. As the engine struggled, a sound drifted down from the forest, a long, haunting howl that carried through the clear mountain air. Not quite wolf, not quite dog, something in between, or perhaps something else entirely. Ash's farewell. The engine caught suddenly, rumbling to life. Sophie sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, listening as the howl faded into silence. Tears blurred her vision briefly, not of sorrow but of understanding. The price of her transformation had been paid. The covenant was sealed. As she pulled away from the trailhead, driving down the winding forestry road, Sophie glanced in her rearview mirror. The mountains rose behind her, ancient and indifferent, just as they had appeared when she arrived. But now she knew better. They weren't indifferent at all. They were watchful, waiting. In the glass of the mirror, her eyes caught the light strangely, one reflecting amber, the other a pale, lunar glow, before shifting back to their normal brown. Sophie didn't flinch at the momentary transformation. She accepted it, just as she now accepted her role as guardian of the threshold. She would return to her life in Portland. She would heal. She would create art that hinted at the truths she'd discovered. And when the mountains called her back, when the threshold required its sentinel, she would answer. The forest had claimed a piece of her, but she had claimed something of the forest in return. The spiral never truly closed. It only opened into new patterns, new cycles, new transformations. Sophie drove on, leaving the mountains behind, but carrying their secrets within her. Firelight sentinel, threshold walker, daughter of the boundary, forever changed, but finally whole. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.